Chapter 11 of Pollyanna Grows Up. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Anderson. Pollyanna Grows Up by Eleanor H. Porter. Chapter 11. A Surprise for Mrs. Carew. The matter of repairs and improvements having been properly and efficiently attended to, Mrs. Carew told herself that she had done her duty, and that the matter was closed. She would forget it. The boy was not Jamie. He could not be Jamie. That ignorant, sickly, crippled boy her dead sister's son? Impossible! She would cast the whole thing from her thoughts. It was just here, however, that Mrs. Carew found herself against an immovable, impassable barrier. The whole thing refused to be cast from her thoughts. Always before her eyes was the picture of that bare little room and the wistful-faced boy. Always in her ears was that heart-breaking, "What if it were Jamie?" And always, too, there was Pollyanna. For even though Mrs. Carew might, as she did, silence the pleadings and questionings of the little girl's tongue, there was no getting away from the prayers and reproaches of the little girl's eyes. Twice again, in desperation, Mrs. Carew went to see the boy, telling herself each time that only another visit was needed to convince her that the boy was not the one she sought. But even though, while there in the boy's presence, she told herself that she was convinced, once away from it, the old questioning returned. At last, in still greater desperation, she wrote to her sister and told her the whole story. "I had not meant to tell you," she wrote, after she had stated the bare facts of the case. "I thought it a pity to harrow you up, or to raise false hopes. I am so sure that it is not he, and yet, even as I write these words, I know I am not sure. That is why I want you to come, why you must come. I must have you see him. I wonder, oh, I wonder what you'll say. Of course we haven't seen our Jamie since he was 4 years old. He would be 12 now. This boy is 12, I should judge. He doesn't know his age. He has hair and eyes not unlike our Jamie's. He is crippled, but that condition came upon him through a fall 6 years ago, and was made worse through another one 4 years later. Anything like a complete description of his father's appearance seems impossible to obtain, but what I have learned contains nothing conclusive either for or against his being poor Doris's husband. He was called the Professor, was very queer, and seemed to own nothing save a few books. This might or might not signify. John Kent was certainly always queer, and a good deal of a bohemian in his tastes. Whether he cared for books or not, I don't remember. Do you? And of course the title Professor might easily have been assumed, if he wished, or it might have been merely given him by others. As for this boy, I don't know. But I do hope you will. Your distracted sister, Ruth. Della came at once, and she went immediately to see the boy. But she did not know. Like her sister, she said she did not think it was their Jamie. But at the same time there was that chance. It might be he, after all. Like Pollyanna, however, she had what she thought was a very satisfactory way out of the dilemma. "But why don't you take him, dear?" she proposed to her sister. "Why don't you take him and adopt him? It would be lovely for him, poor little fellow, and—" But Mrs. Carew shuddered and would not even let her finish. "No, no, I can't, she moaned. "I want my Jamie, my own Jamie, or no one." And with a sigh Della gave it up and went back to her nursing. If Mrs. Carew thought that this closed the matter, however, she was again mistaken. for her days were still restless, and her nights were still either sleepless or filled with dreams of a maybe or a might be masquerading as an it is so. She was, moreover, having a difficult time with Pollyanna. Pollyanna was puzzled. She was filled with questionings and unrest. For the first time in her life Pollyanna had come face to face with real poverty. She knew people who did not have enough to eat, who wore ragged clothing, and who lived in dark, dirty, and very tiny rooms. Her first impulse, of course, had been to help. With Mrs. Carew she had made 2 visits to Jamie, and greatly did she rejoice at the changed conditions she found there after that man Dodge had tended to things. But this, to Pollyanna, was a mere drop in the bucket. There were yet all those other sick-looking men, unhappy-looking women, and ragged children out in the street, Jamie's neighbors. Confidently she looked to Mrs. Carew for help for them also. "Indeed!" exclaimed Mrs. Carew, when she learned what was expected of her. "So you want the whole street to be supplied with fresh paper, paint, and new stairways, do you? Pray, is there anything else you'd like?" "Oh, yes, lots of things," sighed Pollyanna happily. "You see, there are so many things they need, all of them. And what fun it will be to get them! How I wish I was rich so I could help, too. But I'm most as glad to be with you when you get them." Mrs. Carew quite gasped aloud in her amazement. She lost no time, though she did lose not a little patience, in explaining that she had no intention of doing anything further in Murphy's Alley, and that there was no reason why she should. No one would expect her to. She had canceled all possible obligations, and had even been really very generous, any one would say, in what she had done for the tenement where lived Jamie and the Murphys. That she owned the tenement building she did not think it necessary to state. At some length she explained to Pollyanna that there were charitable institutions, both numerous and efficient, whose business it was to aid all the worthy poor, and that to these institutions she gave frequently and liberally. Even then, however, Pollyanna was not convinced. "But I don't see," she argued, "why it's any better, or even so nice, for a whole lot of folks to club together and do what everybody would like to do for themselves. I'm sure I'd much rather give Jamie a nice book, now, than to have some old society do it. And I know he'd like it better to have me do it, too." "Very likely," returned Mrs. Carew, with some weariness and a little exasperation. "But it is just possible that it would not be so well for Jamie as if that book were given by a body of people who knew what sort of one to select." This led her to say much, also, none of which Pollyanna in the least understood, about pauperizing the poor, the evils of indiscriminate giving, and the pernicious effect of unorganized charity. "Besides," she added, in answer to the still perplexed expression on Pollyanna's worried little face, "very likely if I offered help to these people they would not take it. You remember Mrs. Murphy declined at the first to let me send food and clothing, though they accepted it readily enough from their neighbors on the first floor, it seems." "Yes, I know," sighed Pollyanna, turning away. "There's something there somehow that I don't understand. But it doesn't seem right that we should have such a lot of nice things, and that they shouldn't have anything, hardly." As the days passed, this feeling on the part of Pollyanna increased rather than diminished, and the questions she asked and the comments she made were anything but a relief to the state of mind in which Mrs. Carew herself was. Even the test of the glad game in this case Pollyanna was finding to be very near a failure, for, as she expressed it, "I don't see how you can find anything about this poor people business to be glad for. Of course we can be glad for ourselves that we aren't poor like them. But whenever I'm thinking how glad I am for that,